So now we are going to move to the discussion panel component where we're going to field some questions from you in the chat. And so I will launch straight into that. And we'll start with you and ask from the chat window here. And I think you showed some data like this. Has FAO done predictions in terms of like what if scenarios if certain practices were adopted, and what would be their impact on greenhouse gas emissions or achieving net zero by 2050?
Yes, thank you. So we do have some prospective work more than prediction under different scenarios. What we don't have yet, and I'm not sure I've seen that from any source actually, is what is net zero, what is the composition of net zero in terms of reduction and sequestration in a variety of contexts. I guess it's because too early in the net zero discussion to have gotten there maybe. But what we do have is this mapping of a potential reduction according to a number of practices. For example, I showed what is achievable in OECD dairy production or in small ruminant production in West Africa. And then on the other side, we have separately potential for sequestration. We don't have work that is considering all this for achieving net zero. So this is still in the making, please, anyone in the panel, David, Korb, or even you, Mario, if you know of a source that has looked into this potential for net zero in a list of countries, I'd be happy to look at that. But so far, I haven't seen that.
Well, it's a very daunting task, is it not, in terms of for the world under various different farming systems with different you know, in terms of the social fabric, economic fabric of various different countries. Wow, what a task. So I kudos to you. Our next question here, well, this is touched upon, I believe it was touched upon probably in the plenary session, about plant-based meats. And the comment here, and then this is open to anybody, there's a lot of resources and processing involved in the production of plant-based meats. And really the question here is, are they really good from an LCA perspective when we consider all that compared to raising animals? Anybody care? I realize it might be out of some of your wheelhouses, but what do you think, Korb?
Oh, you're throwing it to me. That is handy. The least expert person on the panel. So I will give you an opinion, a non-scientific opinion, but it seems to me that if we're going to have a circular economy where we provide the nutrient that grows the plant, that feeds the protein to produce for people, that doing something in a laboratory is opposite to that. If I think it was mentioned in a previous presentation that we would need food grade feed to feed the organism that produces the plant-based meat or the lab-based meat. So I would love to know the numbers behind that. My gut feeling is that we can do a much more sustainable and circular job of creating protein and nutrients through livestock or animal agriculture and some kind of renewable agriculture, but I could be proven wrong. So that will start it out. David, I'll pass it over to you.
I'll turn on your mic, Dave.
I think one of the challenges is too often we place these kinds of considerations in an either or scenario. It's either beef or plant-based or cultured meat. I think it's more useful to think of it as blending, where do these things serve a better purpose and how would they work together? I don't think there's any chance we're going to become a vegetarian planet. At the same time, I think there is a role for plant-based products to lighten the footprint of agriculture. So I think it's a more nuanced way of considering that. And I know I'm not answering the question about the LCA because I don't know about the LCA, but I'm always a little afraid when it's presented as a this versus that type of comparison.
Okay. Well, we have to keep in mind too, you know, the whole idea of food production is to provide choice to people to nourish themselves. And some people are going to choose, let's say, plant-based, others will choose animal-based, and others will choose various other things. So I think the key thing is to provide choice. And okay, and then let's see.
Mario, if I may just add something on the LCA, and I completely agree with what David and Korb said, but on the LCA, maybe something that is coming up now is what is a nutritional LCA, and this is something that we see more and more on the criticism part for plant-based substitutes, is the nutritional composition and whether they do actually provide as much nutrition as what they're supposed to replace, whether they bring, for example, too much salt or too much additives in the diets compared to the more natural products. So I think if we move to what people now refer to nutritional functional units in LCA, we would be in a better position to compare those foods as well.
Yeah, I really liked what you said in your presentation, Anne, about the percentage of recommendation, like that 100 grams of product times the number of nutrients. That's a great way to measure the effectiveness of food. And if we could bring everything to that level and maybe include our greenhouse gas emissions per level of nutrients, it would be a great way to ultimately compare what's out there.
So what do we mean by a nutrient? What is the great equalizer?
I'll let Anne answer that because she had that in her presentation.
Well, I mean, I'm no expert like you, Korb, but I recently had the chance to collaborate with eminent nutritionists, and we got a cool paper on nutrition and environment for animal source food. And what I learned in this process is you have to consider micronutrients, not only protein, energy, and fat, but micronutrients like iron, calcium, zinc, vitamin B12, folate, vitamin A. And I also learned recently that more than a third of women in the world are iron deficient. More than a third of women in the world are. It's not only happening in low-income countries. A third of American women, for example, lack iron in their diet. So this is something that we see more and more evidence about. And it's not only about enough food, it's also about enough diverse food now. And nutrition is really, really key at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that nutritional density per GHG that you showed in your figures there, Anne, that was really, really interesting. That really, usually we talk about per pound or 100 pounds of live carcass weight or protein, but in terms of that, got me thinking quite a bit. Is an equalizer protein as the nutrient? We seem to have a great hunger for protein on this planet. Is that also wrapped up in there?
I guess it's a start, but it's not enough.
Not enough.
If you look, for example, at the Eat Lancet report, there was an equalizer on kilocalories and protein with Eat Lancet. But there's recent work from the same nutritionist I mentioned before, for example, Ty Bill in California, who showed that with such a diet, you might equalize in terms of protein, but not in terms of iron, calcium, and zinc, for example. So it's a start, but it's not enough.
Okay. Good. We'll next here we question about manures. So manure popped up in a lot of talks here, and I guess processing of manure or what to do with manure. Okay, to compost, to not compost, to digest, bedding systems to rearing livestock so that the manure is the composition of manure, type of manure is produced is quite different. Obviously in um, confined or large operations, the manure is quite different than small landholders that say we would have, like you were mentioning, various countries in Africa. And what are thoughts on there in terms of technologies, approaches to reducing emissions? I'm going to start with, who can I pick on? David. You're muted, Dave. Dave, you're muted.
I'm not sure I'm the best person to respond to that. I can speak in terms of manure and nitrous oxide emissions, but I'm going to pass on that one.
You're going to pass on. Okay.
I'll start from a farming perspective then, Mario. I think as a farmer, I've got multiple different types of manure on my own farm. For example, we have a composted bedded pack. We have bedded packs. We have shavings in different parts of the barn. We have straw packs. I also digest all of our liquid manure. So we do a little bit of everything. In the end, I think it really is up to the farmer, but there has to be a change in mindset to see manure as a resource, not a waste. It is one of our most valuable resources that we just discredit completely. And I'll just use a little example. When we put our digester in 2012, I guess, the neighbors obviously thought we were crazy. What are these people doing, building huge tanks in the middle of their field? But over time, they started to realize, and I think it was through our custom operator, that our yields were better than the neighbors' yields. And I do not use commercial fertilizer. I exclusively manage my manure. So they started to realize that. So it's taken 10 years, but now my manure has value in the neighborhood after it's gone through an anaerobic digester. So I have neighbors now lining up and willing to pay for it based on nutrient value. My video looks like it's going crazy there. Hopefully you can hear me. Based on nutrient value and how clean it is. Like there's lack of weed seeds and a lack of other contraries. So I think that is the first and foremost thing with manure, is that we have to see it as a resource, analyze it like a resource, value it like a resource, use it when you're supposed to use it. And I think, to David's point, adding a fifth R is really important. And we just need to treat it like fertilizer, but better than fertilizer.
Okay. But, we've been talking about the value of manure for a very long time. It's been difficult to come about and seen it as an added value product. But you see optimism there. Okay, David, you want to say something now, David?
Yeah, you triggered. I think one of the challenges we have in manure is it contains a lot of water, and that makes it very difficult to transport. And we've located a lot of our animal production systems in absence of a land base. And I think one of the brief economic challenges in the effective utilization of manure is getting the manure to where it needs to go. And that's a structural challenge that I think we need to address in terms of how we decide where we're going to site livestock operations. So I really like this concept of processing the manure to remove the water to produce a higher value soil amendment, because I think we do, as has been pointed out multiple times, manure contains carbon. That's an important soil building element. Not only from a carbon sequestration perspective, but in terms of soil health and the productivity of soil systems. But water is a big problem.
Yeah, I keep seeing new technologies related with dewatering, various approaches to that. That's a key thing, I guess, particularly with the methane, reducing the methane emissions and ammonia volatilization from the slurries. Now, of course, a large part of the world doesn't have quite that same issue with manure. We're talking about small landowners, holders in the world where the manure is not in slurries and various things like that. So I wanted to, you had a nice slide there, Anne, where you talked about carbon, and it was about crop residues and crop residues being used as feed for animals. And so I've done a bit of work in Africa, and it seems to always be that does the carbon go to the soil or does it go to the animals? And it seems to be this big question. Of course, the people need feed for their animals. Can you help us understand this issue?
Well, thanks, Mario. It's a good question actually, and this is a a question that comes back all the time. We're talking about conservation agriculture, and why is it not adopted more? For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, covering the with residues or limited tillage and so on. What we saw, for example, in countries like Zambia or Malawi is in these cases, you have large subsidies for fertilizers in support of maize production. So it's more profitable for farmers to grow their maize and to move the animals to more marginal lands around. And it's not profitable actually to kind of collect the crop residues from the maize and process them to make them more digestible and use them as feed. So they're not even used as covering for covering the soil, but they're just left to dry standing, And I think there's an interesting point here of how by subsidizing, by intervening for food security, we kind of end up in situations where we unbalance the situation between crops and livestock that were initially very well integrated, but that we disintegrate, wrong incentives. So that's just one example. But what we see on the other side is that in terms of nutrition, and agronomic and agroeconomic potential, it's very interesting to just have a really simple nutrient balance. And in most cases, you only need about 30–40% of the crop residues to be returned to the soils, and the rest you're free to use either for construction, for fuel material, or for feeding your animals. But we do kind of unbalance things by providing the wrong incentives sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In terms of incentives, I think with you three gives us a really good example where, let's say, with the Canadian situation, where we heard about farmers, growers, actively trying to reduce emissions. So, related with fertilizer use, for example, or related with milk production. But Anne, you were also showing about what could be done in the world with financial support for countries that don't quite have the economics on hand. And so there seems to be quite a bit of need for donors and assistance from outside those particular countries. So it was quite a juxtaposition for me to see that. And I get the sense that things are going to move in Canada on their own, from growers, from the purchasers, processors, grocery, the food chain, food system. But in other countries, there really needs to be assistance. An external assistance. Are we really there and willing to support net zero everywhere in the world? Sorry, I'm picking on you, Anne. I think you're giving us a global perspective, which is something maybe we don't see quite often.
Well, it's really my pleasure. No, that's all right. Well, it's really interesting for me to see where things are at in Canada, because we see, as you said, Mario, some countries in the world are moving towards this. So I saw the breeding index in Canada. I also saw that breeding index for emissions in Ireland, actually. Then we're talking about greenhouse gas emission taxes in New Zealand. So some countries are really strongly moving towards regulation and I would say even institutional and scientific mechanisms in place to support moving towards net zero. And as you said, in many other countries, case, and what we're doing there is to try and include those climate, what we call co-benefits, to classic livestock development. So increasing the breeding quality of the breeding, the animal genetic diversity, the animal genetic resources quality in the countries is something that we do for productivity, for food security and nutrition reasons, but it also has a climate co-benefit. So this is something we also start to show, and in some cases it's possible to show because, for example, in the World Bank is in many countries doing financing basically the livestock development and taking the role in some way of national level investments. You know, when the size of the projects, when you have a 200 million project over a few years doing vaccination campaigns and so on, it's basically a national policy. But they do have commitments in terms of climate that they need to show. Their investment in each of their livestock project in their portfolio has to show some climate co-benefit. So we're moving towards this. What is still missing is the livestock share in what we call the climate finance. So the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, or the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF, which is also handled by the World Bank, but where I would say rich countries put money for climate actions in less rich countries, let's say. In these places, livestock is still not really present, and it's becoming something interesting because of the Global Methane Pledge from the Glasgow COP. But this is really new, and we don't have many examples. So I agree with you when you say, you know, it needs finance, and the finance is increasing, but it's not yet there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my perspective. Huh?
Okay. David?
I think we have a slightly different situation, I think, here in Canada, in that these mitigation credits are going to have value of their own, but I think they will have value. I think both the government and the supply chain are demanding these credits, or will be demanding these credits, and so I don't think we can look necessarily to external financing to do this in terms of the UN type processes and whatnot. But I think the real challenge we have right now is that, for example, if we look at most carbon trading practices, the amount of documentation and transactional costs used to measure and document these emissions exceed their value. And so it's too complex. Yet in our national inventory report, we're not even capturing the activities, so that's too simple. And so I think we have to move to an intermediate, practical way in which producers can document their actions to reduce emissions in a way that's practical for the producer, but still has value either to the supply chain or to government or to both. And then I think these kinds of credits will have true value. And then we'll see. I mean, the carbon market in Canada is going up because of legislation, but we'll see the true value of these credits being transferred back to the producers. And then I think that'll start to influence management to a much greater degree than it is now.
Okay. Korb, what do you think? What do you think, Korb, about the data and willingness of producers to provide those data and metrics on the production efficiencies and greenhouse gas emissions and so forth?
I can't speak for all sectors, but dairy is very data driven. Having said that, there's an administrative burden on farmers right now that is fairly massive, and whether it's regulatory or governmental, there's lots going on, and there's a huge amount of data that we are collecting and managing, and it's not managed very well right now. So I think that's going to be a massive undertaking for sure in our industry, but ideally in agriculture in general, to simplify that data, to start having systems talking to each other. And I'll give you an example in dairy. So we have very good production data through Lactanet, individual cow data. With our robotic milking machines, there's lots of individual quarter data on every cow, and it's held in one category. We have a traceability system that is national held in another one, and animal welfare that's held in another one. And throw on top of that financial, employment, environmental stuff, all in other little silos. At some point, those silos need to come together, and they need to interact and talk. And that way it reduces my burden, but it also allows science to do their job and governments to do their job. So I think data, there will be more and more of it. We just have to figure out as a collective how we're going to manage it and how we're going to monetize it. And I think David's point is exactly right. We need to figure out how to monetize as much of this environmental attribute as we can, to finance the next project to do better, because it will be a short-term attribute. As we get better and better, carbon will have a lower and lower value. Let's figure how we can use that and use our financial tools to do the next project. And then hopefully by the time we get to 2050, carbon will be valueless, but we'll be running a relatively sustainable system.
Okay. This question, what do we have that incentivize practices, incentivize towards reducing footprints? What mechanisms do we have at the moment to do that?
So in my sector, so I'll use my digester as an example. The thing that drove digester technology in Ontario was a government policy called the Green Energy Act that allowed us to connect into the grid and guaranteed us a 20-year contract to sell our electricity. Without those two things, there wouldn't be a bank on the planet that would give you money to build a digester. So having said that, they locked us in at a very good price at the time, but it's a locked-in price for 20 years. We're at that 10-year mark in my contract, and the swing, I'm about even now. So by the end of this contract, the government will have signed up for a fairly good deal on electricity over the 20 years. It helps the environment, and it helps the farm, and it helps the rural economic development. So I think some of those types of thought processes will really help to encourage some of these larger scale investments on farm.
Good. David, do you see any incentives there on reducing emissions, particularly N2O?
Well, I think that there's a need for incentive early on to allow practice discovery, if you will, to try something out on the farm and that sort of thing. And I think that's a different kind of an incentive versus recognizing the long-term value of emissions reduction or a carbon storage. So I can see an important role of governments in incentivizing trying out new practices. The example was given about the biodigester, front-loading some of the rewards so it can be financed. But longer term, I really do think that these credits need to pay for themselves. Their true value in the market system has to be reflected so that the economics of the system allows itself to play out.
Right.
But I do think there's a role for governments to allow people to try things.
Okay. Also took from your presentation, Dave, that about improved efficiencies, for example, in this case, in terms of using practices to reduce N2O emissions or nitrogen losses in general, which would then allow optimizing nitrogen rates, and so that the farmer not actually taking on a burden in terms of a cost, right? And that's an incentive. Well, in terms of making sure that it's not a negative in terms of returns.
Yeah, and in communicating to producers that concept of taking the same nitrogen dollar and just put it into an enhanced efficiency and source and giving that a try, that's been very a lot of producers have responded to that, because you see the price of fertilizer and say, why would I buy something more expensive? What's the point? Well, if they can see it's cost neutral, at least they're much more willing to try it. One of the other things that we're encouraging also is using simple test strips in their farm where they don't have to do the entire farm, because that can be cost prohibitive. It's a high risk situation. Whereas if you can just try it on a small part of the field or something and say, get a level of comfort with that new practice.
Right. Experiment and see what the results are like. And how do we incentivize related with livestock production and practices? In a lot of the countries that you were presenting data from, it's quite different than in Canada, with large herds and operations, much smaller. How do we incentivize at the farm level there?
Well, I mean, it's very different. I agree with what David and Korb said, and for countries like Canada or for example, what we have in Northern Europe as well, they are very good examples. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Live Carbon Dairy initiative in France and other European countries, where there is a whole supply chain mechanism for reducing emissions with different time frames for different farms and an inventory at year 1 and year 5 and a whole MRV system, and eventually the industry paying for extra bonus for by kilograms of milk delivered to pay for this more interesting product for the whole industry and for the client, so that it's guaranteed also by the ministry. So here it's an interesting supply chain level with science, farmers, industry and government all involved in the same one. But in different types of countries, then the incentive also has to come from the market. I really strongly agree with what David said. There's only so much we can do with fiscality or with subsidies, and eventually it has to pay for itself. But what matters in many countries where the systems are not in place yet is access to market. So, for example, in Western Kenya, the dairy sector is very active. It's very impressive the rate of development they have, and even the payment system is very innovative. They pay for the milk on mobile phone. Kenya is one of the most dynamic countries in the world in terms of mobile phone payments. It has the largest share. So this is very efficient for dairy farmers, but what matters for them at the moment is to access market and to be able to supply the growing market in the cities, for example, and all what it takes in terms of infrastructures, roads, but also cooling systems, processing plants, and so on. So there are different forms of investments that need to be made also for this in different kind of supply chains.
Okay, David.
There are some other interesting options through crop insurance or risk management programs that are being tried, where special rate on a crop insurance or special access to a risk management program might be encountered by adopting some of these practices. So I think there might be some, they're not subsidies per se, but there's sort of cross compliance type mechanisms that could also benefit the producer.
Let's turn. We're running out of time, unfortunately, but let's turn to tracking net zero and the path there in terms of how well we're doing. So we heard about tier 1 and tier 2, and hopefully we should be moving towards tier 3 pretty soon, so we can really track this. But and I got from your presentation that a large portion of the world is still dealing at the rudimentary level in terms of with tier 1, which probably means the algorithms and the coefficients and so forth are probably vastly under or overestimating emissions, for example. And even in Canada, as David was mentioning, that we have our protocol for tier 2, let's say with emissions of N2O from fertilizer, does not capture actually most farmer practices that can actually reduce N2O emissions. So I just open up the floor to all about this. What would you recommend that we do to improve this system of tracking how we're doing in terms of reductions? What would you recommend? Course of action. If you were able to tell people to do one thing, or tell the government or United Nations to do one thing, what would you say?
And you better start
I'm
this
listening
one.
then.
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to pick on David. I know you're going to come up with something fast about N2O, David.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you look at sectors like dairy, which have had to provide a lot of information for various safety and type metrics. They've willingly done it because it's increased the value of their product and given them access to market. And I think in the end, that's the kind of thing that will incentivize producers to gather and share some of that data if it results in an increase in the value of their product. So as we start branding products as being green or somehow more sustainable, and metrics are needed to document that, it's important that costs go back to the producer. So there's a reason to share the data, because there's, if the federal government asks producers for data, there's going to be a hesitancy there, right? Or even the supply chain, unless the producer sees true value in making giving them greater access to the market or giving them a better price.
Okay. Anything on the protocol development in terms of, let's say, moving to improve tier 2 and tier 3? Do you see any hope there? Let's say, for example, in Canada, we're moving fast enough to, we have a 2030 voluntary target for N2O emission reduction, but we seem to be a little bit behind on the estimation of emissions and how to incorporate those practices to achieve those goals.
I do think we're making great advances in terms of accessing a variety of data about soils, about climate and that sort of thing. So there is a wealth of data available to us. The missing piece is activity data. We still don't have a way of capturing what's actually happening on farm.
Okay.
And again, I think that's where little sectors like the dairy sector are way ahead of us.
Okay.
Hopefully that's one of our collaborative efforts too. Like, so if the dairy sector, if we are working at this together as a national project, aggregating data will help a lot. So we'll aggregate our data, hopefully be able to monetize it when we aggregate, but maybe we can aggregate our efforts to measure as well. So whether that's developing a data system that is usable, whether that's contracting organic matter drones to measure vast quantities of land instead of small parcels of land. I don't know what it is, but there are opportunities to work together more effectively than like David said earlier. You can't monetize your carbon right now because the administrative burden is bigger than the return. But collectively and aggregated, maybe we can do a better job. So yeah, I think there's opportunity there. But in terms of collecting it, that's a massive project, and I'm not sure who puts all those pieces together. There's one thing that we do that we have the advantage of with cows and dairy, and I saw a question in the chat there. How do we measure? Some of that is through our milk, and we can do bulk tank analysis. And because of the spectral data that we've collected for years, we can extrapolate that bulk tank analysis to measure fairly accurately the emissions within a herd, including the replacement inventory that aren't milking yet. So within a couple of years, we're verifying and validating that data right now with sniffers in actual herds, but the milk data will allow us to accurately measure emissions from all of our animals on farm. Now, if the soil guys can help me measure the soil stuff on farm, then we're really putting the pieces together.
And how do we improve estimations? I'm particularly here thinking about countries that are still on tier 1. How do we help them out? Do we need to assist in helping provide a framework for tier 2 development for assist countries in doing that? What do you suggest?
Well, I mean, what we're trying to do, and it's not only FAO, but all of the partners we work with, is really this transfer of capacity. You know, there's a lot of capacity development to be done. It's not only about training on greenhouse gas emission, it's also about assistance, regular assistance. The problem in many countries is that the inventories are done by the Ministry of Environment. And the livestock development is done by the Ministry of Livestock or the State Department of Livestock. So those things are usually not connected. So when the activity data is partially available, it's not reachable to the ones who are in charge of the inventory. So there's a lot of institutional capacity development to be done as well. And I agree with David. In many cases, we don't have the activity data. In a lot of countries, actually, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but in a lot of countries, it starts with the number of animals. We're talking about dairy cows. In many countries, there's a national census happens every 10 years, and you don't have a breakdown in terms of dairy cows or other animals. So even the categories of animals for accurate greenhouse gas emission reporting is not available, and sometimes we're not even sure the total number of animals reported is reliable, because those animals may be ranging over very large distances, even transboundary movements, transhumances, and it's very hard to track that. So this is also part of what needs to be made more available, better tracking of animal numbers to start with, as the very basic of activity data. Not to mention, emission factors. very incredible work done, for example, in East or West Africa on measuring emissions and coming up with actual emission factors from these systems, because we're still borrowing methods and equations that are not based on tropical livestock and usually borrowed from Western systems. This is being developed, so emission factors are also being improved, but the activity data is in a lot of cases still missing.
Okay, it's quite a theme there on activity, regardless of the system that we're really talking about. Where in the world? Interesting. Okay, we need to be cognizant here that it's running late. It's almost 1 hour and it's midnight in Rome. So we want to make sure you get rested up for tomorrow to tackle these great challenges. So I'm just going to ask, just do a quick round the table. Do the scenario. You are talking with a group of school kids. What would you like to, what's your message to them about net zero? Because, you know, a lot of children out there, my kids, they're pessimistic. You know, they're taught in school that it's doom and gloom. What's your message?
I'll start. I hate silences. So I was really optimistic until I heard Henry this morning, and then
yeah, he bummed me out too. He tried to
I know
save us, but
he tried, but it still doesn't work. I'm still feeling bad about this, but I am generally a half-glass full person. So what I tell my kids, so I've got a 12-year-old, an 11-year-old, and an 8-year-old, is that this is a process. This is not going to happen overnight. That this is something that we have to strive for every day, and it's little choices that we make. So whether we're talking about our farm or our life or our future, these are a series of little choices that we make. So if I'm talking particularly about agriculture and our dairy farm, our goal is to use as much as we possibly can, to waste as little as we can, to provide a nutritious product that we are proud of, and not only in what the final product is, but how we got there. So that includes animal welfare, that includes restoring and regenerating the land. I think that I always am optimistic that as a farmer, we have more opportunity to solve this problem than anybody else in the world. That we've got the opportunity to provide what humans need no matter what. Ultimately, if we're being honest with ourselves, the problem is not agriculture. The problem is too many people on the planet consuming too much. So if they're going to consume, they have to eat, and we have a job to do to feed the planet. So let's do it in the best possible way we can. And every day we make an improvement. And that is genuinely a philosophy on our farm. And I think it should be within agriculture itself.
Okay, good. Anne or David?
Maybe I'll go next. I think one of the amazing things about humanity is when we actually decide to do something, we can do it amazingly well. We have incredible creativity and incredible industry to get things done once we've decided to do them. And I think the real challenge here is we've got to move away from the why not into the how, and actually just decide we're going to do this and set about doing it. And I'm encouraged that I think we're approaching that stage in this whole discussion. We've had decades of arguing about climate change, but now I think we're getting on the page. We're saying this is something we need to do for many reasons, not just climate change, also in terms of soil health and the sustainability and value of our products. And I'm encouraged that we're going to do it.
Good. Anne?
Well, I don't have children, so I'm really not the expert here. But well, I know that what I would like to say and what I try to say sometimes is you know, be curious about what you eat and where your food is coming from. Be curious about how it's produced and what other people eat. You know, be curious about what how other people live on the planet. Just you know, find the information, ask questions, and ask farmers really good source of information. So really about knowing what you eat, what you do, where things are coming from, and getting the information. I'm afraid there's a lot of misconceptions and you know, information that are confusing. So the best advice I would say is be curious and try and find information.
Great, excellent. Okay, so I'd like to thank you all. You've been very generous with your time and your expertise. And yes, Korb, you are an expert. I do not know how to milk a cow or produce milk, so you are an expert for sure. Okay, so thank you all. Thank you, Anne, for, I know we've kept you up late here, so thank you for being with us and joining us. Thank you to Tim and Henry for starting us off for this 3-day adventure in such a phenomenal, thought-provoking way. A little bit of housekeeping business. Don't forget about the QR codes if you are collecting CEUs. And also, we will be back tomorrow for the second day. The day starts off at 9 o'clock with the Holos training. And then at 1 o'clock, 1 p.m., 1300 hours Central Time, we will be with the talk portion. We will start off with student video presentations, so don't miss that. We have 5 great student videos to share with you. And don't forget, you can also assist us in providing comments on those, because there will be a ton of cash available for those students to win. And I think that is it. We're going to sign off. Am I missing anything from others on the organizing committee? Is there anything else you would like me to say or jump in and say? Roland, Kim?
I think we're good. Thank you very much for the panelists, for all our speakers so far, and definitely looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow again, if you can make it.
Have a lovely evening, everyone. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.